So to start out with, our starting point today really is 1821, and just to sort of remind us where we are, in 1821, Texas, at least at the dawn of 1820 or 1821, Texas was still part of, it was a province of New Spain, as Spanish Mexico was known. And I really liked Frank's, I liked the metaphor that Frank used when he talked about Texas being the what the space behind the backyard shed of New Spain and later of Mexico, that sort of area that you don't pay much attention to. You certainly don't ever really go out there, but you're not willing to let anybody else squat on it either, right? And you're not, you understand that you need it because it's part of your property. And that was really the situation. That was a good way to look at the situation, the sort of place that Texas held under Spain, and to a large extent that it would also hold under Mexico, although as Andrew pointed out, that would begin to change as the 1820s wore on. So the situation, just to sort of recap what you've already been told, in 1821, Mexico finally, after 10 years of intermittent but bloody fighting, Mexico wins its independence from Spain. But the situation was anything but stable as of 1821. Mexico was both politically unstable. There wasn't even widespread agreement about what basic form of government Mexico should have. There were out-and-out monarchists who believed that even though Mexico was independent, it should set up its own monarchical system of government. In fact, that's what triumphed initially. And there were Mexicans who we would have called liberals, meaning that they supported the idea of a sort of constitutional republic of some sort, a representative republic of some sort. And those lines of political disagreement, as you well know, would continue for the next 15 years, and in fact, well beyond that. When you start focusing on Texas, of course, you learn that Texas is really in a lot of ways dominated by the Comanche Indians. At least the portion of Texas that we see on this slide, the sort of central, northwest, and central parts of Texas were definitely part of what one scholar has called the Comanche Empire. Lots of other Indian groups in other parts of Texas. And really those Indians, the Indians had always allowed the Spanish to have a foothold there. Often they judged it in their interests. Certainly the Comanches could have wiped out the Spanish settlements almost any time they wanted to, if they had really set their minds to it. So Indians are a real issue, and they would be a real issue for the Anglo-Texans really from the time that they arrived. So by the time you get down to 1821, as Frank pointed out, Texas is in dire financial condition, as is all of Mexico. When Mexico became independent in 1821, for example, the output of all of the nation's mines was 1/3 of what it had been in 1810, and mining was probably the most important national industry in New Spain and Mexico. Texas had been certainly neglected during the long Mexican Wars for Independence. And in fact, some of the bloodiest parts of the wars had been fought in Texas, which again, Professor de la Teja talked about. So when we get down to 1821 and newly independent Mexican Texas, There are really only three centers of non-Indian population. Those are the San Antonio region, the La Bahia, will later be known as Goliad region, and then way out here in East Texas, the settlement in and around Nacogdoches in the piney woods of East Texas. The last Spanish governor of Texas, Antonio Martinez, was desperate for any solution that would protect Texas both from the Indians, who are sort of on all sides, especially the Comanches, and also from the rapidly westward expanding United States, which was now sort of on the far eastern flank of Mexican Texas, and again rapidly expanding. So that's really the situation as far as Texas is concerned. The grand total of the non-Mexican population may be 2,500, or non-Indian population, the Tejano population, maybe 2,500 in 1821, maybe not even quite that much. So what is the situation in the United States? Well, a couple of important things to keep in mind. First of all, the United States had been expanding rapidly, in part because of very generous land policies. The United States government had very lenient, a very lenient program for granting or selling off the massive amounts of U.S. government-owned public lands in all the western states. But in well, a couple of things happened. First of all, in 1819, there is a national depression called they called them panics in those days. So the so-called Panic of 1819, the first really serious national depression that the United States had endured really since the Republic had been formed. There have been ups and downs, but the so-called Panic of 1819 was a deeper and more severe economic downturn than any that had been seen before. Jobs were lost. My office light is on a timeout when I'm not moving. There it is. We have light again. Jobs were lost. Unemployment soared. And in the face of that, the very next year in 1820, the United States government, in a very, I think, probably an ill conceived change in policy, changed the federal land policy. This time, instead of selling public lands on credit, they reduced the price, but now you had to pay cash. So as of 1820, you could, in the public lands of the United States, you could buy 80 acres of the remaining public domain for $1.25 an acre, so that's $100, but you had to pay cash. And $100 doesn't sound like a lot of money to us, but it was about a year's wages for a working man. And in a time of severe depression, that put purchasing a small farm, an 80-acre farm, that put it out of the financial reach of most ordinary Americans, especially in the wake of that depression. So immigration historians like to talk about push factors and pull factors affecting immigration. In other words, what are the factors that are sort of pushing settlers out of their country of origin, and what are the factors pulling settlers into a new country? Clearly, the push factors motivating American citizens to consider immigrating into Mexican Texas are the economic downturn and the change in land laws. One other important factor worth talking about, and that involves cotton. For the 20 years prior to 1821, the Cotton Kingdom, as we often call it, the Cotton Kingdom had exploded across the Deep South, driven by the industrialization of the cotton textile spinning and weaving industry in England and in continental Europe, and then a little later on in the northeastern United States. That industrial revolution, fueled by American cotton, had created almost inconceivable opportunities prior to the recession of 1819, almost inconceivable opportunities to make a fortune. Places like Natchez, Mississippi, for example, and this is a picture of one of the mansions, and the antebellum mansions built in Natchez, Mississippi, a little bit after the 1820s, but you get the idea. Natchez was even by the 1820s, the county that contained Natchez was per capita the richest county in the United States. Okay? If you could get a piece of productive cotton land in the 18 teens and 20s in the American South, and you could get the labor to work it, and that meant slave labor because there was no market. You couldn't hire free labor to do that work. If you could get the productive land and you could afford the labor to work it, and everything fell just right for you, within a very few years, the weather's right, and you can make a few big cotton crops and buy more slaves and more land. You could literally become wealthy, but almost beyond people's wildest dreams. And so while there's a temporary slowdown in that due to the recession, everybody in the American South knows that this is the equation, right? So always keep that in the back of your mind when you're thinking about Texas. Texas does in the 1820s and 30s. Texas doesn't exist in a vacuum. Okay, Texas exists on the leading edge of that expansion of the greatest economic revolution that the world had ever seen, and that was the Industrial Revolution, driven by the cotton textile manufacturing industry in Europe and the northeastern United States, fueled by cotton grown by slave labor in the American Deep South. And Texas is right on the edge of that in the 1820s. So that's the situation. In steps an enterprising Missouri businessman named Moses Austin. Now, Moses, we don't have time to talk much about Moses Austin, but he had made a small fortune, actually a princely fortune, in the lead mining business, first in Virginia and then in Spanish Upper Louisiana, in the area that is today southeastern Missouri. But Moses had been wiped out by partly by his own reckless business practices, but really by first the War of 1812 and then the Panic of 1819 had wiped him out once and for all. And he was a very proud, sort of haughty, sort of almost egomaniacal kind of a character. And he was determined to make his fortune back. And in 1820, he had hit upon the idea of approaching the Spanish authorities in San Antonio and proposing to import American settlers into what was then still Spanish Texas. It was an audacious idea. He traveled to San Antonio. He met with the governor, and there were a lot of adventures. And I'm sure you tell the stories about his chance meeting to your classes with his chance meeting with the Baron de Bastrop on the streets of San Antonio. But long and short of it is that Austin secures the permission of the Spanish governor, a sort of provisional permission, to introduce 300 American families into parts of Texas that were not really settled by Tejanos. By the time Moses Austin made it back to Missouri to actually begin the plans for sort of recruiting colonists, two things happened. Mexico wins its independence from Spain, and by the shortly after his arrival back in Missouri, he gets sick and dies. And so the enterprise that he had envisioned is left in the hands of his 26-year-old son, Stephen Fuller Austin. In temperament and personality, you couldn't have found a father and son more different than Stephen and Moses Austin. Moses was brash and reckless and a big talker and a big dreamer and schemer. Moses would have been a great West Texas oil wildcatter in a different lifetime. Stephen was quiet and cautious and thoughtful, very much the opposite of his father. And as it turned out, young Stephen had what it took to see this colonization venture through in ways that his father never would have been able to. Stephen inherits his father's venture, goes to Texas, is granted permission, again, provisional permission, to introduce his father's friends or families. But almost immediately, the Mexican authority, the authorities in San Antonio say, you know, there's a new national government in Mexico City. You better go to Mexico City and get the new government to approve it. This, of course, was the governor of Emperor Iturbide. After a while, Austin has to spend a year in Mexico City. Finally gets permission, arrives back in Texas in 1823, just as the Iturbide government collapses, and Mexico goes back to the drawing board to draw up its first constitutional Republican form of government in 1823-24. Stephen Austin immediately starts putting ads in American newspapers. Settlers, with those push factors and pull factors that I've talked about, immediately start streaming into Texas, and Austin becomes the first so-called impresario of Texas, a term that loosely translates as colonization agent. Okay. The impresario system was later formalized by the new state government of the state of Coahuila y Tejas, Coahuila in Texas. Here we see a map of the state. Of course, you saw this in your previous presentations. But just take a quick look at the map here. You see that the Texas part of Coahuila and Texas, while larger, it really, again, you've got San Antonio, a little tiny settlement in Nacogdoches, and a struggling settlement at La Bahia. But really, the new state government is headquartered at Saltillo down here in the southern part of the new double state. And Coahuila has about 10 times the population that Texas does. So Coahuila is definitely the tail that wags the Coahuila and Texas dog, as it were. And this would be an important factor in the sort of political dynamics of Texas as we move through the 1820s and into the 1830s. The state government in 1824 and 25 works out its own state level colonization laws. And starting in about 1825, let's see here, starting in about 1825, where are we? There we are. The other contracts are granted to other impresarios. And here's a map that shows some of those major impresario grants. There were eventually about 40 granted. Most of them never came to anything. Most of them, the impresarios never settled a single settler. Austin was, by a very large margin, the most successful and effective of the impresarios. He would eventually sign 5 colonization contracts with the government. His first one with the national government, and then 4 more with the state government at Saltillo. Other impresarios included Green DeWitt to the south. That's the impresario grant that had that had Gonzales as its capital, its headquarters. Martin de Leon, probably the other most successful one, who was in fact himself a Mexican impresario, who settled the colony around the Victoria area, and then a bunch of others that had varying degrees of success or not so much success. Still, by the mid 1820s, Anglo-Americans have already come to outnumber Tejanos. They stay mostly separate from the Tejano population. The Anglo population centers are very much in the let's see. Oops. There we go. They are very much. Well, I think my slideshow's not working here. Hang on with me. Okay, there's our impresario grant map, I hope. So here we see Austin's colony, at least his original colony. He would eventually sign a contract for another colony up here, and really all of his subsequent colonies also continued to fill in the gaps, the unsettled gaps within the boundaries of his original colony. So we often hear about Austin's colony or Austin's colonies, and it's a kind of complicated situation, but really mostly it was this area bounded by the watersheds of the Brazos River and the Colorado River. And he kept getting these new contracts that allowed him to continue bringing in more settlers to his colony, and some above the old Camino Real in what he called the Little Colony. Anyway, and you see the other impresario grants here. So how did the impresario system work? Well, the laws gave the government gave the impresarios, again, who are colonization agents. They are agents of the state government. It gave them the authority to recruit settlers, settle them on their lands, distribute the lands, distribute land, official land titles to the colonists. And certainly in the early years of Austin's colony, Austin had almost dictatorial powers within his colony. Eventually, by the second half of the 1820s, the more civil government is being established. Come on, Mike. There you go. Is being established so that there becomes a more sort of regular civil government in the Anglo parts of Texas. But the way the system worked was this: under the impresario laws, a settler who professed his intention to be a stock raiser, cattle or sheep or whatever, could qualify for one Mexican league of land. A league is 4,428 acres. Okay. If he announced his intention to be a farmer, he could only get a Mexican labor, L-A-B-O-R, so looks like labor, a Mexican labor of land, which was only 177 acres. All right. Well, guess what? Most of Austin's settlers and settlers in other colonies, well, they decided they were going to be both stock raisers and farmers. So they would get both the Mexican League, the 4,428 acres, and the labor, another 177 acres, for a grand total of just over 4,600 acres. Now, I always tell my students, let's stop and think about how much land that is. Okay. 460 acres is a square mile of land, what we refer to in the English system as a section of land. 640 acres is a square mile. So think about how much land 4,600 acres is. I'm not much of a mathematician, but we're talking about good many square miles of land. This was far more land than anyone could farm, certainly with no matter, even if you were a large slave owner, you could only farm, you could only plant crops on a tiny sliver of that. Probably more land than most people could even effectively run cattle on. You know, you'd have more. You would have more land than you would have ever have cattle. You couldn't fence it, certainly. So what's going on here? Why so much land? Well, you've got to put yourself in the minds of these people. Let's say they could raise 100 acres of cotton, or if they were a large slaveholder, maybe 200 or 300 or 400 acres at the most. What are they going to do with the extra several thousand acres of land? Well, their idea, of course, was if we can keep immigration coming in, someday there'll be a cash market for this land. In other words, everyone who came to Texas, virtually everyone who came to Texas from the United States, had done this calculation in their head. And their calculation was, yes, maybe I can raise cotton and get rich. Some people, the ones with slaves, certainly thought that. But they and everyone else certainly had dollar signs in their eyes. Someday I'm going to get rich by selling off the rest of my land. Everybody, there was an article published many decades ago called Land Speculation as a Cause of the Texas Revolution. And it kind of made the argument that land speculation was really important. Well, everybody was a land speculator, all right? Everybody who came to Texas, in one way or another, was planning on cashing in on their lands. If you could also grow cotton, then it's a double whammy, right? And the settlers poured in to Austin's and other colonies. And Austin expressed great optimism very, very often in these early years about how well things were going and how the settlers keep pouring in. But there were also problems. And let's talk about those problems. First of all, there's the Indian problem. And that story's been told already, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. Only to say that within the areas of Anglo colonization, and again, if we were to go back to our impresario map, within those areas, especially Austin's colony, these were areas mostly beyond the Comanche Empire, beyond Comancheria, and after the very first few years where there was some a good many clashes with the Indians, the numbers of Indians, which had reduced precipitously especially due to diseases to which they had no immunity to, the numbers had been reduced severely, and Indians are really only a sort of occasional problem for the Anglo settlers. Certainly the Anglo settlers didn't have any great love for Indians. And Austin's own Indian policies were a strange mixture of sort of pragmatism and cruelty. If Indians would stay out of the way, he was fine with Indians. But the minute that they were a problem, quote unquote, for his settlers, he was willing to do whatever it took, including waging more or less genocidal wars against them. So there are the Indians, and they remain a problem. A bigger problem, really, for the Anglo settlers is the problem that the Indians pose in East Texas, because what has happened in East Texas, well, as Professor Smith pointed out, in the 18 teens, a band of American Cherokees has settled in the Nacogdoches area. And those Indians were a much more formidable threat than the relatively small struggling tribes that were hanging on in dwindling numbers down in Austin's colony and its region. So Indians are an issue. Maybe a bigger problem, though, are the settlers themselves. It turns out that the sort of people who tended to come in the Mexican Texas tended to be very individualistic, very self-reliant, very unruly people. Austin complained bitterly about, Austin was this sort of college-educated, genteel, sort of Enlightenment man, and he had very little patience for these rough and tumble frontiersmen who made up such a large proportion of his colonists. And things really came to a head in late 1826. In late 1826, over in the Nacogdoches area, an American named Hayden Edwards had been granted an impresario contract by the state government down in Saltillo. And Hayden Edwards, remember, Nacogdoches was an ancient Tejano settlement. He started throwing his weight around, got crossways with the local Mexican government and with old settlers, and before long he hoisted the banner of independence and declared the Republic of Fredonia. It was kind of a comic opera episode, but deadly serious from the Austin perspective. Austin had to immediately started writing to Edwards and to his colonists saying, have you all run mad? You know, you're going to ruin it all for the rest of us, Anglos. And eventually Austin calls together his own colony's militia. They march with Mexican troops to East Texas to put down the rebellion, and Edwards and his colonists turn tail and flee. And the Fredonian rebellion comes to nothing, but it sent a real wake-up call to the Mexican government. And in the, there's slaves picking cotton. And in 1828, the Mexican government decided it was time to do something about these Anglos in Texas. They sent a respected soldier and scientist named Manuel de Mier y Terán on an inspection tour of Texas. Terán spent almost a year in Texas, and we traveled all the way to the Louisiana border, met with Austin and others. And when he went back to Texas, went back to Mexico City, he filed a report very critical of the role that Anglos were playing in Texas, and he made a list of recommendations that needed to be followed. And in 1830, the Mexican government finally issued a decree, the so-called Law of April 6, 1830, based upon Terán's recommendations. And that law, among other things, proposed to shut down the impresario system, end Anglo immigration, station Mexican troops in Texas. It did some other things, but those are the two biggies. This immediately set off alarm bells in Austin and his colonists. Austin used his political stroke to secure an exemption for his colony from the anti-immigration ban. About the same time, Mexico in 1829, Mexico had issued an emancipation decree emancipating all the slaves in Mexico. Austin had also gotten an exemption from that. But after 1830, 1830 is a real turning point, okay? Austin and his colonists and other Anglo-Texans are increasingly worried about what Mexico's long-term intentions are, particularly will they allow slavery to continue long-term, and will they allow unfettered immigration of Americans? Remember, there's all that shows huge land grants that people are expecting to cash in someday. My time is out. I'm not going to sort of fight the events that lead up to the Texas Revolution, because I know that's going to happen tomorrow. I just want to leave you with some thoughts about sort of what are the major takeaways to my presentation that I'd like for you to sort of take back to your classrooms with you. First of all, in keeping with the theme of this institute, I think it's useful if we think of Texas during the Mexican period, think of it as a borderland. Now, when we say that, what do we mean? Well, I think what we mean is that Texas during these years is is a place where several different cultures and nationalities met and mixed with no one group truly dominant, right? It's on the edge of Comanche, yes. It's on the edge of the United States. It's on the far northern frontier of Mexico. And you've got all these different groups sort of contending for power and prestige. You've got Indians, you've got Spanish slash Tejanos, you've got Anglo-Texans, you've got African-Americans who, by the way, even though they are enslaved, are always pursuing their own interests too, and are a constant state of fear and concern for their masters and other white and brown Texans, for fear that they may someday revolt against their masters. So Texas is this messy borderland place where groups are sort of contending for dominance. So that's really the first thing I want you to take away from this. Secondly, I think it's always important for us to think about Texas, not just in the Texas context, not just in the regional context, not in even the continental context, but think of Texas in this period in a global context. And the global context here is the ongoing industrial revolution in England and continental Europe and the northeastern United States, fueled by the cotton textile industry, which in turn is fueled by southern slave-grown cotton. And that, coupled with the weakness of newly independent Mexico and the aggressiveness of the United States, that global and certainly hemispheric context is really the only way to make sense of Texas history in this period. And then finally, I would argue we need to do our dead level best to avoid what I would call the old chauvinistic tropes of Texas history. In other words, it's okay to explain the context of explain the meaning of the phrase manifest destiny and where it came from. But let's really work hard to get away from thinking of Texas the way, say, that Eugene C. Barker thought. Barker was Austin's famous 1925 biographer who wrote his big book on Stephen F. Austin and subtitled it, it's The Life of Stephen F. Austin. The subtitle is Founder of Texas. That's interesting. And then the further subtitle is A Chapter in the Westward Movement of the Anglo-American People. Okay? Now, the westward movement of the Anglo-American people is important, but Texas in the 1820s and 30s is a whole lot more than just a chapter in the westward movement of the Anglo-American people. That's an old, chauvinistic, Anglo-centric, in many ways, in this trope that in many ways sort of smacks of white supremacy, and we need to get over it. We need to stop thinking of Texas as some sort of a Texian Iliad, some sort of a dramatic tale of intrepid, self-reliant frontiersmen conquering the frontier. I mean, this is a trope that was still very much alive and well into our own times. Instead, I think it's better to start thinking of it as a contested empire, as this recent book, which I think all of our presenters this week had a hand in. Think of it more as a contested empire, a contested borderland. So, with that, I'm going to turn the floor back over to Professor Torget.